story. I was so shocked by reality that I began to search for a way out of it. And that way I thought would come through reading. Because my father was murdered in the pawn shop, my family wanted me to have nothing to do with the business. But my grandfather needed me then more than ever. So I returned to the store, now in my father's place, in spite of the fact that I was just a 10-year-old kid. Since books were non-negotiable items in my community, the giving of them was considered not only impractical, but taboo. Nobody gave people books. You gave money, maybe you gave some clothes, but you never gave books. Sometime shortly after my father's death, though, my uncle Pasquale gave me a copy of Luigi Barzini's The Italians. He just handed it to me without even a word, assuming that through his glance that I would know what to do with it. So that became the book that I never read. I didn't read that book. Why? Because it was Italians. Why should I read about Italians? I was Italian. I thought I knew everything. The next book that was given to me was called The Godfather. Now, my father was killed when I was 10 years old, and he was killed a few weeks before he was to be the godfather to somebody in our family. And because he was dead, I, at 10 years old, became the godfather. All right, so this was like 1964? No, 63, I'm sorry, 63. 6 years later, the book The Godfather comes out, and one of my aunts sees it in a bookshelf, and she said, oh, Freddie's a godfather, let me give him this book. She didn't read it. I read that book, and that was the first book that ever spoke to me. How many people have read The Godfather? You probably haven't read it. Yeah, us people of a certain age, I'll say. The novel came out a year after my grandfather was killed in a holdup in the pawn shop. He was the next one. With him gone, the business was sold, and I was free to find my own way through the world. One of the ways I searched was crime. Throughout my high school years, I was accused of being in the mafia, so during my senior year, I decided to investigate this subject through my senior semester-long thesis paper that my Irish Catholic prep school required. One way or another, I had been connected to the mafia since I left my Italian neighborhood to attend this school. So I decided it was time to find out what this thing called mafia was. This was the first writing project to excite me. I searched the Barzini book, and between him and Puzo, I thought I had it all figured out. When I completed my paper, I was certain to get an excellent grade. But the committee gave me a C. I thought, what do you mean a C? And they gave me a C because they said, you used Italian sources, and you're Italian, you were not objective in this paper. Which is ridiculous, but. So I read the C grade as punishment for my cultural transgression and decided to stay away from anything but English in all my future studies. Now, my sophomore year in high school, the guys I worked for, my mother put me to work for two guys in organized crime at a restaurant supply business. Their father, who was the head of the Genovese family in New York, when he was killed, I had kind of a reprieve. I took care of them for a year because they were not allowed out of their houses by the Chicago mob. And after that, they each gave me $3,000, and they said, go, leave, get out of here. And I went to the University of Wisconsin and didn't turn back, like I said, until I wrote the book From Wise Guys to Wise Men. I went around, I went hitchhiking, I took some time off from college, hitchhiked around the United States. And when I returned to college, I began studying literature and film with the idea of getting a teaching job, because I figured I can't make a living writing, and so I'll do something very practical and teach. And I became this kind of reluctant academic then. Each novel led to another. I began with Mario Puzo's earlier work, The Fortunate Pilgrim. So I began to see, I began to search Italian-American literature. I found him. I found this guy, Pietro Di Donato, Christ in Concrete. And in Pietro Di Donato's novel, I heard my hod carrier grandfather. I don't know if you know what a hod carrier is. A hod carrier is the guy who carries the mortar up to the guys who are laying the bricks. So he's got like 50, 60 pounds of mortar on his shoulders, climbing up a ladder, bringing it to the guys who take it and use it to make the bricks. But in that novel, I heard my hot carrier grandfather through Jeremiah's dreaming out loud while he worked on a construction site saying, "Laugh, laugh, all of you, but I tell you, all my kids must be boys, and that they someday will be big American builders, and then I'll help them put the gold away in the basements. But am I not a man to feed my own with these hands? Ah, but the day will end, and no boss in the world can then rob me of the joy of my home." I began to see what work was, what work meant. Now, I had one grandfather who had died when I was young, who told me, if you work for money, you're going to spend your whole life working for money. If you put your money to work for you, you won't have to work the rest of your life. I didn't understand that. My younger brother did, because he retired when he was 50. And my younger brother had an office with secretaries, and my mother, I'm the oldest in the family, and every time my mother would call me up, she goes, "Why you answer the phone?" I said, "Because it's you, Ma, I'm talking to you." She goes, "Wow, your brothers, they got secretaries, they answer their phone." And I thought, she didn't consider me being an academic as that big of a success. It was my brother who became some kind of, what did he do? He did mortgages, and my other brother became partners in a BMW dealer and so on. They had secretaries. I was just this guy. But again, I was the oldest son, so that made a bit of a difference. So I started eating up all these Italian-American novels. The more I read of these Italian-American writers, the harder it becomes to focus on. I was doing my master's thesis on Walt Whitman. Why? Because the University of Chicago would not allow me to do Italian-American writers. I asked them if I could do an Italian-American writers for my thesis, and they said no. So I did Walt Whitman. But then when I went on for my PhD, I told them, now I'm going to, they said, no, you can't. Nobody here will support you. So I had to leave my PhD. I didn't get my PhD until I was 40 for that purpose. But after that, it seemed everywhere I turned, I found another Italian-American writer. I began scouring used bookstores. I looked everywhere for these. But these writers, Fante, Puzo, Berolini, all taught me how to re-see the world I lived in, how to listen to and speak about that world. They filled the gaps created by my family's refusal or inability to discuss the past. I took whatever I needed from these writings to make sense of my life. I became obsessed with gathering everything, cookbooks, self-published novels, poems, good and bad. I began to develop a growing sense of Italian-American culture that reached beyond my family and broke the stereotypes I was consuming through the American media. Through Jerry Mangione's Mount Allegro, I began to understand the struggle involved in forging an identity out of two competing ways of living and thinking. Quote from Jerry, "We gradually acquired the notion that we were Italian at home and American, whatever that was, elsewhere. Instinctively, we all sensed the necessity of adapting ourselves to two different worlds. Here were the words that explained what I had felt all my life, but could never understand. Italian-American literature was giving me myself. The writers took material from their families, their neighborhoods, and turned it into informative and entertaining tales of how to deal with difference. Often I realized that they might be revealing things about their families that I could never say about mine in public, let alone write. But they, especially the women, were teaching me that the writer could break the cultural code of silence, omertà, and still live." All right, that's from the essay. It goes on and on and on and on. I think you have it, right? Okay, so, but I do want to read just the tail part of it.